Siona God, hello all. Oshtisanali, good morning, and Wado. Thank you for watching. So this is day 6 of reading Black Rednecks and White Liberals by Thomas Sowell. And I'm going to reread that sentence that I had to cut short, because I was like so into it. And I was just like, oh my gosh, the time. Anyways, let me see here. Oh, that was a long sentence. Okay, anyway, despite a tendency to attribute black-white differences in the United States to a legacy of slavery, blacks from the West Indies also had a history of enslavement, but brought with them to the United States a very different culture that was reflected in such things as differences from the native-born black populations in entrepreneurship, education, and imprisonment rates. In short, what the two groups of blacks shared was a history of enslavement, but what they did not share was the redneck culture. The disproportionate number of prominent blacks who came out of small enclaves of transplanted, my goodness, I'm going to get that gnat. Anyway, jeepers. The disproportionate number of prominent blacks who came out of small enclaves of transplanted New England culture in the South likewise underscores the impact of cultural differences. While only circumstantial evidence is possible on the connection between the cultural characteristics of Southern rednecks or crackers in the past and those of ghetto blacks today, that evidence is considerable. However, even if one were to dismiss all of that evidence as sheer coincidence, the redneck culture would still not be irrelevant, for it provides a demonstration of the counterproductive effects of such a way of life. External explanations of black-white differences, discrimination, or poverty, for example, seem to many to be more amenable to public policy than internal explanations such as culture. Those with the point of view tend to resist cultural explanations, but there is yet another reason why. Some resist understanding the counterproductive effects of an anachronistic culture. Alternative explanations of economic and social lags provide a more satisfying ability to blame all such lags on the sins of others, such as racism or discrimination. Equally important, such external explanations require no painful internal changes in the black population, but leave all changes to whites, who are seen as needing to be harangued, harangued, threatened, or otherwise forced to change. Exactly. What? In short, prevailing explanations provide an alibi for those who lag. An alibi is for many an enormously valuable asset that they are unlikely to give up easily, as Eric Hoffer put it. There are many who find a good alibi. Hoffer, Hoffer. There are many who find and it's Eric with a C, Eric, good alibi far more attractive than an achievement. Huh. That's true. Oh my God. For an achievement does not settle anything permanently. We still have to prove our worth anew each day. We have to prove that we are as good today as we were yesterday. But when we have a valid alibi for not achieving anything, we are fixed, so to speak, for life. Oh my gosh. However, as he said elsewhere, America is the worst place for alibis. Sooner or later, the most solid alibi begins to sound hollow. Absolutely. Those who provide black rednecks with alibis do no favor to them. Exactly. To other blacks or to the larger society in which we all live. And in American society, achievement is what ultimately brings respect, including self-respect. Only for those who have written off blacks' potential for achievement, with alibis being an acceptable substitute. The liberal vision of blacks' fate as being almost wholly in the hands of whites is a debilitating message for those blacks who take it seriously. However convenient it may be for those who are receptive to an alibi. Whether the black redneck values and lifestyle are a lineal descendant of white redneck values, a lifestyle is suggested here, or a social phenomena arising independently within the black community and only coincidentally similar, it is still a way of life that has been tested before and found wanting, as shown by its erosion over the generations among whites who experienced its counterproductive consequences by making black redneck behavior a sacrosanct part of black cultural identity. White liberals and others who excuse, celebrate, or otherwise perpetuate that lifestyle not only preserve it among the fraction of the black population which has not yet escaped from it, but have contributed to its spread up the social scale to middle-class black young people who feel a need to be true to their racial identity, lest they be thought to be quote-unquote acting white. It is the spread of a social poison, however much either black or white intellectuals try to pretty it up or to find some deeper meaning in it. And yeah, like that totally, I mean, it freaking nailed it. I mean, on so many levels, I was thinking of so much stuff. I was thinking about how like Ben Carson came from poverty, a broken home, and all this stuff. And he had people around him that stepped up. So, like, I think it was like a teacher or a coach or something. And they like made sure that he stayed productive, that he never got sidetracked because he was around like gang activity and all that kind of stuff that he could have easily just went right on into. But, anyways, he became a world renowned brain surgeon, and he developed a technique to operate on babies' brains. And yet, instead of looking up to him, people are like, "Oh, he sold out. He's working for the white man. The white man's paying him to say all this stuff about black people." And he's like, "No, you need to have an intact family unit. You need to have all of these things to build up children and not fail them." And they're like, "Oh, it's crazy to me." And then another thing I was thinking, let me see if I can see it real quick. Hang on. Oh, yes. So when you see people at protests and they're yelling to trying to get through to the black people who are like being terrible, and they're black people themselves, right? They're yelling, they're like, "Get off of the plantation. You're on the plantation now. Can't you see that?" It's because they have realized, the people who are yelling that, right? Because the others are like, of course, saying to that person that they are in fact wrong or whatever. But the person's like, "You can't see it now. You're in it. You can't see it." It's because they got out of it, right? They became woke. Not the white, the right form of wokeness, okay? They woke up to the right thing. And that's realizing what this book is saying, that this behavior is not right, right? And once you realize that, your whole world opens and you can see all the propaganda saying, "You can't do this, you can't read, you can't write, you can't use a computer, you can't go get an ID, you can't," when they're sitting there with it. And they're like, "But I can read and I can write. But I mean, this guy's saying that I can't." And then, yeah, how come I have to go get an ID to do this? I shouldn't have to do this. And it's like, wait, whoa, 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 whoa. You can read and you can write, honey. You have an ID. You can go get whatever changed on it that you need to, or whatever. You know how to do these things. Don't let people talk you down and make you and brainwash you into thinking that you don't know how to do this stuff. And you can do for yourself. You can go stand in the long line to get help, to get the jobs and stuff for like workforce or whatever. You can go and do that, spend a day and invest in yourself, right? You can do it. Bring some water, bring some snacks, bring a good book, right? Get help building your resume and all those things. And the workforce place does it for free to you because it's paid by the taxpayers and they get reimbursed by the government or whatever it is, right? Anyways, are Jews generic? Ooh, getting it. If any given country, a particular minority, may be hated for any of a number of reasons peculiar to that country or that group, however, in a worldwide perspective, the most hated kinds of minorities are often not defined by race, color, religion, or national origin. Often they are generically, quote unquote, middleman minorities, excuse me, who can be of any racial or ethnic background and in fact are of many. Many of the historic outbreaks of inter-ethnic mob violence on a massive scale have been against the Jews in Europe, the Chinese minorities in various Southeast Asian countries, against the Armenians in the Ottoman Empire, the Ibos, or Ibos, Ibos in Nigeria, and against other middleman minorities in other times and places. While many kinds of minorities have been persecuted and subjected to violence, the sheer magnitude and duration of the persecution and violence unleashed against middleman minorities eclipses that unleashed against other kinds of groups. Conquered Aborigines or formerly enslaved groups, for example, might be held in greater contempt, but lethal animosities on a mass scale have been particularly often directed at middleman minorities. The mass slaughter of tens of thousands of Ibos in mob attacks in Nigeria and the horrors inflicted on the Vietnamese quote-unquote boat people, in parentheses, most of whom were ethnically Chinese, close parentheses, have been reminiscent of the pogroms, Pogroms, against the Jews in Eastern Europe, and the term quote unquote genocide has been used to characterize what happened to the Armenians in the Ottoman Empire during the First World War, as well as the Jews under the Nazis a generation later. Smaller violent rampages against the businesses, homes, or persons of middlemen minorities have been common around the world, whether directed against the Lebanese in Sierra Leone, the Japanese in Peru, the Indians in Burma, or the Chinese in Southeast Asia. Get it? It's not just black people, okay? So freaking knock it off. Other kinds of minorities have, of course, also suffered violence, but the scale of lethal mass violence against middleman minorities has been unequaled. And whenever you bring it up, they dismiss it. Like, it doesn't matter. It's only their race that matters, right? And that's prejudice. That's racism, okay? But they'll tell you that they're not racist, though. Like, it's like the gaslighting, right? All the blacks lynched in the entire history of the United States do not add up to as many people as the number of Chinese slaughtered by mobs near Saigon in 1782, or the Jews killed by mobs in Central Europe in 1096, or in the Ukraine in 1645, much less the slaughters of Armenians by mobs in the Ottoman Empire during the 1890s or during the First World War. Only the Nazi Holocaust exceeded the slaughter of Armenians, and while the Holocaust was the ultimate catastrophe for Jews, it was also the culmination of a long history of lethal mass violence unleashed against middleman minorities around the world. What do all these groups have in common, and why have they been hated so much? Partly the resentments and animosities against these groups have derived from the economic role they play, a role that has been widely misunderstood and widely resented in very disparate societies, disparate. Over a period of many centuries, even when the economic role has been played by people not ethically different from those around them, differences of race, religion, or ethnicity added to the resentments arising from the economic role itself have produced explosive mixtures and many times in places. The economic role. Middleman minorities have been intermediaries between producers and consumers, whether in the role of retailers or money lenders. The retailing has ranged from the modest level of street peddlers to that of grand merchants owning chains of stores, and money lending has likewise ranged from the level of the small neighborhood pawnbroker to that of the international financiers. Jews have historically been the classic middleman minority, to whom others have often been analogized, jeepers. The overseas Chinese as, in quotes, the Jews of Southeast Asia, in quote, the Lebanese as the Jews of West Africa, and that was in quotes, the Parsees, Parsees, as, in quotes, the Jews of India, and the Igbos as, quote unquote, the Jews of Nigeria. For example, Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice was a Jew, and the story revolved around his money lending. Numerically, however, the 36 million overseas Chinese are more than twice as numerous as all the Jews in the world. Among other prominent middlemen minorities have been the Gujaratis, or Gujaratis, Gujaratis from India, who have played the middleman role in the countries ranging from the South Pacific islands of Fiji to the United States and South Africa. Armenians have been another prominent middleman minority in countries around the world. And the Chettiars, Chettiars from India, have specialized in the middleman occupation of money lending in many times and places. In addition to these international middleman minorities, there have been ethnic groups who played this role in particular countries or regions, such as the Marwaris, Marwaris, in India's state of Assam, Assam, or Koreans in America's black ghettos. Middlemen and minorities have often been middlemen in a social sense as well as an economic sense. They have often served as intermediaries between social groups who, for one reason or another, interact better through third parties than they do directly. Sometimes there are differences in language and culture as between members of colonial establishment and the indigenous population that they rule, such as between the European overlords in colonial Africa and the African population with whom they had economic and other transactions by the Lebanese and the intermediaries in West Africa. Sometimes there are vast differences in status, which make both groups uncomfortable in dealing directly with one another, as for example, Polish noblemen who used Jews to collect rents from the peasants. None of this is new. In ancient times, Milesians, Milesians, played the middleman role in this sense. The Milesians not only were familiar with the Greek culture of the mainland, but also were conversant with the Near Eastern cultures of Lydia, of Cappadocia, Cappadocia, of Phrygia, Phrygia, of the Phoenician lands of Egypt, of the whole Levantine world. Traders they were, wandering about, speaking with great facility this, that, or the other tongue that they found necessary to transact their business. Armenians in the Ottoman Empire were likewise middlemen in the social sense, as well as the economic sense. Armenians, although persecuted, possessed wealth and influence to a considerable degree because they had succeeded in the course of centuries in making themselves indispensable to their overlords. The Turk, after all, was not familiar with the intricate web of seaborne traffic, with the many languages of the Near East, with commercial accounting, even with elementary, and in short, was not able to get along without his despised Christian slave, in parentheses, because that's what the Armenian was, at least a semi-slave, close parentheses. During the centuries of Mongol domination, Mongol, domination in Central Asia, Armenians likewise served as trade envoys, interpreters, and soldiers. In modern Sierra Leone, the Lebanese were often middlemen between the Europeans and the native Africans, investing the time to become better acquainted with local African languages and the African way of doing things, as well as with individual Africans. The Chinese played a similar role during the colonial era in French in Indochina, and of what were then called the Dutch East Indies. It was said, in quotes, all that the natives sold to Europeans, they sold through Chinese, and all that the natives bought from Europeans, they bought through Chinese, end quote. Such intermediary roles are not without their hazards. High prices, for example, may be caused by others, but it is the middleman minorities who directly charge these prices who are likely to be blamed. The manufacturer may be raising his prices, or the government may be raising taxes, or the cost of doing business in a given neighborhood may be higher because theft, vandalism, and violence raise the cost of insurance, or for other reasons. But in any case, those who charge the customers their higher prices are more likely to be blamed than those who cause the prices to be higher. Where those who cause the higher prices are of the same ethnic background as the customers of the middleman and the middleman is ethnically different, then it is a virtual certainty that the middleman will be blamed by the customers and by their political and other leaders. In the case of aristocratic or colonial overlords, where a middleman minority collects the rents or taxes that these overlords impose, or otherwise serves as an economic or social intermediary, the resentments of the masses may again be directed at the middleman, who is seen face to face more so than at distant overlords. What was said of the Chinese in the days of the Dutch East Indies could be said of other middlemen in other places and times. In quotes, the natives detested the Chinese, for they saw in them the active agents of a system of oppression by which they were frequently reduced to beggary, end quote. Because the middleman is essential to the overlords, these rulers may protect him when necessary from overt violence. On the other hand, during periods when resentments reach the point where the governing powers themselves are at some risk, nothing is easier than to throw the middleman minority to the wolves and not only withdraw protection, but even incite the mobs in order to direct their anger away from the overlords. Although there have been many middlemen minorities over the centuries and around the world, the tragic history of the Jews, as a people without a country for 2,000 years, climaxed by the Holocaust in which 1/3 of all Jews in the world were murdered, is unique. Yet, the history of many other groups in other times and places has borne a remarkable similarity to that of the Jews in a number of ways. Though, of course, no two groups are the same in all ways. These similarities include their economic patterns, their social patterns, and the pattern of responses they have evoked from others. Some observers have seen the resentments toward middleman minorities as being due to their prosperity, but truly wealthy people have seldom provoked the kind of rage and bitterness directed at middleman minorities. Even in times and places where most middlemen were far from rich, it is not just what these minorities have achieved, but how they have achieved it that evokes suspicions and resentments. Till we meet again, love you, mean it.